outside the classroom. So whichever you want to start.
Okay. In classroom work, I use storytelling with students. First of all, I like to tell a story. I usually start off a session with getting them involved in acting out the story with me, as I did in the videotape. And I think one of the first lessons there is that you're teaching perspective, you're teaching point of view. Sometimes I'll have them act the story out with me, and then I'll have them break down into groups and retell the story, each group telling the story from a different perspective. So if we're looking at the Ash Pet story, for instance, I may have one group tell the story from the Ash Pet perspective, another group from the Hairy Man's perspective, another group from the wicked stepsisters or the two prissy sisters perspective, and just get at the fact that storytelling enables us to be in our imagination and be each of those characters. And if we were looking at somebody who studied Gestalt therapy, that person would say, we are each of those people. And what I like to get people to thinking about is, how do we identify with each of those different characters? Because I identify with each of them. Sometimes I'm the prissy sister, and sometimes I'm like Ash Pet, and sometimes I'm like the hairy man. I can identify with each of those. So I like to do the acting out, get them involved with the role play, get them used to using their bodies and to the notion that we tell stories with words, we use the language, but we also use our hands, we use our faces, our eyes, our voices, we use the body. The storytelling really includes lots of creative movement and improvisation, and that with storytelling, you can have the mental pictures in mind, but we also, in telling the story, have to be very aware of the moment and use what happens at the moment. So in the classroom situation, I do as much as I can with role play. I usually do some exercises, some improvisational exercises, some experiments where people dance to the spoken word, for instance, and just get people used to playing again and knowing that it's not only okay to play, but it's critical for us to play and not to have forgotten how to play. I think the older we get, the more we feel bound into certain roles that we go through, but that's not what play is. Play is really letting the creative self come through. With the story, with the movement, whatever. And that is, there was a quote by Froebel that this fellow sent me when he wrote me a letter, and he talks about play being the true expression of the child's soul. And I think that we have to remember that we have a childlike self that we carry with us no matter how old we get. And I see that child self as the imagination and the creative self. So I do lots of exercises in the classroom to get at that. Come at it from lots of different angles. Sing and dance and write in a ballad. Lots of times I have students and teachers listen to music and write. Just write the first thing that comes in their imagination. What does this remind you of? Maybe I'll give them a theme. But just to get used to expressing themselves and getting comfortable with moving the body and looking and feeling kind of silly, and then working in groups to look at how stories are often told not just by one person but by several. When we're sitting at the kitchen table and we've all had a certain number of experiences, we have the same history, one person may begin to tell the story and the other person adds in, yeah, and it was over there, and then we're back and forth. So to look at how we can develop theater forms out of our everyday lives and conversations. So that's what I do in the classroom. When I am telling these stories in concert, I do a lot of the same kind of thing. I usually mix a concert with the play-like storytelling, where adults will come up and enact with me on the stage or wherever it is these same stories. And the story then takes on a little bit different shape and form because we're dealing with it sometimes on a different level, except that what I believe is that we are again pulling on that childlike self to come forth and help us create this art piece, which is the story of the moment. And I did the Ash Pet story in Elkins, West Virginia last year at a humanities concert, and the people who enacted the story with me were adults, and a couple days later I saw one fella, and he had acted out the part of the prince in the story, and he had this name tag on that said Prince, and the woman who had been Ashpet had on an Ashpet name tag. And he came up to me, he was a doctor, and he said, I want to thank you so much for letting me be a prince, for I have always wanted to be a prince. We hear about these things, we read about them, and we want to see ourselves, to perceive ourselves as these heroes and heroines, which we are. I believe we are. Yet, how often do we get a chance to actually act that out? So I think as adults we are reminded of our creative selves, and then in the adult situation, I use the stories for springboards for conversation about all these issues we've talked about earlier. You know, women's issues, the nuclear holocaust that may be around the corner, pollution, political kinds of things. But it all comes down to just being able to be free to be ourselves and to play.
How do you use stories in things like history, where there's a lot more information to be also passed on? How do you include or integrate sort of this kind of stuff with this methodology?
I believe that every teacher is a storyteller and a performer. Teachers do that day in and day out. University professors do that. Heads of corporations do that. You know, we act and we play roles all the time. History is a great subject to use with storytelling because history is a story. So what we do with that is say, climb into the shoes of these people we read about in the history books, and let's imagine ourselves be there, and let's imagine what that person was experiencing, and let's experiment with it. How do we tell that as the story? Teachers, I think, are often afraid, you know, they'll say, oh, but I'm not a storyteller. But they are. They are storytellers. Teachers, preachers, and politicians are some of the best storytellers there are. So when we're dealing with something like history, for instance, what I try to do is say, okay, look at the story. Let's talk about what happened with these people or this situation, and then take that and play with it, experiment with it. What kind of characters were these people? You know, what do you think they sounded like? What did it feel to be out there on that battlefield or out in that ship or wherever? And to get, you know, teachers used to just playing with it, doing the role play with it, and going ahead and using, again, the same storytelling techniques we'd use to tell a jack tale. You know, use the hands, use the face. If you feel like leaping, if you feel like, you know, using your arms or changing your voice, let us illustrate those characters and those history lessons by using the storytelling techniques. And it's great fun. And adults as well as kids really learn very quickly that way because you've got the feeling. You're there in your imagination.
Yeah, I think that this whole thing of emotion, that you need this emotional reaction to learn. So say a little bit more about how you get this emotional response by doing this acting out.
I was looking at TV one day and I saw a little piece on a fellow who taught French at Dartmouth or Yale or somewhere, I can't remember. But what he did was he would pick up a chair and act as if he were going to throw it at the students and say in French, I'm going to throw this chair at you. So the first thing that happened was their adrenaline shot up and they had to respond in French. They had to be there in this kind of crazy emotional situation in order to learn. Or he taught, and the students learned very much more quickly than in other kinds of classes. It is being there in our imagination. It is trying with our human heart to climb into other people's shoes or into, not even people, but into the elements, you know, to see ourselves and feel as if we are a cloud floating by or we are that little bird. I try to get at that, again, by doing lots of physical kinds of exercises, playing games, singing, dancing, moving, stretching, doing shapes with our bodies, doing things like, there's an exercise a friend of mine who's a dancer taught me, where you enact big and small and you just experience without words often at first what that really is, just to try to get in touch with the feelings, the emotions, and what it feels like to be in these situations, in these characters' shoes, and that with that emotion we can be there, and the learning is much more real, and it sticks with us. I have little kids come to me in the grocery store and say, "Miss Belcher, do you remember me? I was the tree in the story." And it may have been 5 years ago, but I know exactly which story they're talking about. And that kid hasn't forgotten because he's seen himself do something he didn't think he could do. And when I was a child, I was very bashful and looked at the world from here up because I was afraid to speak, afraid to use my voice. I wasn't sure if I was intelligent. I'd heard negative things about being a hillbilly, quote, end quote. And we all go through that. Whether we are a minority, we're poor, we've been discriminated against in some way or another, we deal with self-esteem. So one of the things I like to think that happens with this process of telling the story is that we discover we can do. We can talk, we can move, we can act, we can tell stories, we can create a story, we can create, which to me is one of the most powerful tools we can give to young people in the classroom or to the teacher or to an adult audience or to each other, is that we can.
One of the things that you've done a lot with is Appalachian culture and Appalachian identity. I want you to talk a little bit about that, but also take it into the parallels with cross-cultural and the universality of that.
I like to begin usually a storytelling session with my own story, and then I go into probably, well, most often, a mountain story, because that's the story that talks about my ancestors or my people or my culture. In the process of reading and hearing these stories, I've also read and listened to storytellers from other cultures. And what I know happened with me was that when I had an opportunity to read and study and learn about my own culture, I felt proud. I felt that I was special. I had something unique. I looked at our mountain language that was being talked about, made fun of, and ridiculed all over the place, and I learned that it was poetic and beautiful, that my grandmothers and grandfathers both spoke that language. They were colorful people and creators of language, and that made me feel good. And when I felt good about myself, and I could talk about my own history and stories, what happened with my friends of every color and nationality, Puerto Rican, Asian, Native American, was that we swapped stories, and I understood that we had the same story. In my case, we had gone to the city to look for work. We were poor people. We had been pushed off the land. We had roots that were very much connected with the land. We had folk songs and games and dances that told us who we were, that made us special. And when we swapped those stories, I found out that they had the same story, only it was in their culture. It was in their dialect. It was in their language. So what I understood was that for every jacktail that was collected here in the mountains that came over from Scotland to Ireland to England, came over with the settlers and changed as mountain life changed, there is a parallel story in Russia about a fellow named Ivan. There's a parallel story in Mexico about a guy named Pedro. There's a parallel story in the black culture about a guy named John. And it makes me think that, again, these stories are timeless, they're still relevant today, and they are universal. And what I try to do in starting with the mountain stories and my own culture is to say that I know that every other culture has these stories, and to me it says something very powerful about human beings. If we've been telling the same stories for hundreds of years, does that not say that we have very much in common with each other? And I like to think that we can look at what we have that's unique and enjoy that and help that, and that will help us be more secure so we can be open to people from different worlds, so that we can stop fighting and scratching with each other, I think the stories can help us see that really we're all the same. We're each very different, unique, but we're all the same.
I know you've done some work with communities or with classes where people do their own history and get the history of their community or history of their family or the history of their lives. Would you talk a little bit about how that gives some credibility to their own knowledge and their own experiences rather than reading it in books, gathering it from their grandpas and all that stuff like that? Doing your own histories and making your own history book.
When my family migrated from eastern Kentucky to Chicago, I was very confused and felt homesick. My family thought we'd go home each year, but we never got back home. But what we did was we talked on the telephone with my grandparents a lot. And we went home for all these holidays, and I remember that I wanted to hear my grandmother's talk about her family and her grandparents because I needed those pictures of where I fit in that holler or on that river and where I fit in history. I remember studying about the Union strikes in, I guess, my freshman year in high school in Chicago. And I remember that the teacher was talking about how, they had to send the Pinkertons and the Baldwin Felts down to those places where the men were trying to get the coal mines organized, and they had to bust up those strikes because that was not good. That was stopping production. And I would sit there in my seat and think, now she's talking about my grandpa or my great-grandpa, and I don't agree with the point of view she's talking about because my family struggled with all that, and she's saying it was good. Yet I didn't feel I had the words to explain myself in that situation. I might raise my hand and say something, but I didn't have the words, and I didn't have the history. So I had to keep going back and talking to my family to get more history and reading books, but to hear from their points of view what their history and what the history of this region was. I know that it made me feel more secure and like I knew about my own culture. When I work in the classroom or when I do things with folk arts camps, writing workshops, one of the first things I like to do is send people home to talk to their parents or grandparents or community members to find out what their history, their own personal history is. And people lots of times will say, well, there wasn't anything special. We just worked on a farm, or my daddy mined coal for a living, or my daddy worked in the cotton mills, or my mama was just a housewife, yet she knew how to plant by the signs, whatever. She made quilts. She knew herbal medicines. And we take that information and we look at it and we learn to see how much we really offer to the community and how important it is to know our own histories and how important we've been in creating the history of the community. If we have created the history of the community, then we've created the bigger history. And oftentimes with people who are not in power, people who live in poverty, I grew up poor but my family worked, you see yourself as powerless and not valuable. You don't feel like you belong to this bigger picture. So for me, the oral histories help the young people and the adults and the teachers, whomever it is, understand that we have created the bigger picture. And we are critical in that. And we have to keep seeing ourselves as the leadership we are that's going to create a new picture if we want a new picture. If we're not happy with our lives or our communities, we have to change it. But we need to know that oral history, all of our histories are not written out in the books. We don't see ourselves in the history books. We have to write our own histories and know our own histories. Alex Haley says we have to know where we come from. That's going to help us belong to something, feel that we belong to something, so that we can move on into the future with a sense of identity. Mary Lou Awiatka says at the Radford Conference a few weeks ago, a tree with strong roots needn't fear the winds. And I like to think that's really true. So the oral histories are very important to me. I like to know my own history, and it's wonderful to see what happens when people come in with those histories.
Have you tried to teach economics that way?
Well, in looking at the oral histories, what happens is you hit on farming, you hit on, yes, the economics of the economics of culture and the economics of poverty, the economics of how our whole system works. So that what it enables us to do is start with something very personal and then take it and look at history, look at economics, look at how we are integrated into not just a community economy, but a global economy. So, the stories take us a long, long way. A long way.
Do you think that could lead to taking control of this economy?
I think that once people know whom they are and feel proud of whom they are going to fight for change. It is when we are taught not to love ourselves and not to feel proud of ourselves and to walk around with our heads hung down that we feel so ashamed and inferior that lots of times we don't see that we are worth fighting for. But when people know their histories and they see how they came to be in a position of poverty or a position of less power, then they're going to go out and do something about it. I've seen it.
Could you give some examples? I'm sorry. Why don't